Sign over the inheritance or leave this house with nothing.
Too late. Last night, I locked every dollar inside a trust you can never touch. You did what?
The morning after my 18th birthday, my parents stood in my bedroom and told me I had 7 days to surrender my inheritance or leave their house forever. What they did not know was that the money was already beyond their reach. Hello, my name is Claire Bennett. I grew up in a beautiful house outside Boston, in a family that looked perfect in photographs. My father, Richard, wore expensive suits and managed investment accounts. My mother, Elaine, organized charity dinners and never left the house without looking polished. My younger sister, Madison, was 16, popular, charming, and always treated as if the sun rose especially for her. And then there was me. I was the quiet daughter, the responsible daughter, the one who remembered birthdays, finished homework early, and apologized even when something was not my fault. For most of my childhood, I believed that being easy to love would eventually make my parents love me equally. I was wrong. The only people who never made me earn their affection were my grandparents, Samuel and Rose Bennett. They lived in a modest brick home in Vermont. Although my grandfather had built a medical equipment company worth far more than anyone in town realized. Grandpa Sam taught me how to change a tire, read a contract, and recognize when a person was answering a question I had not asked. Grandma Rose taught me that kindness did not require surrender. A soft heart still needs a strong door, she used to say. When they died in a highway accident 2 years apart, I felt as though the safest part of my world had disappeared. There will left me an inheritance valued at just over $8 million. It included cash, investments, and shares in Grandpa's company. My parents were named temporary custodians until I turned 18. At least, that was what everyone told me. My parents constantly reminded me that the inheritance was a family blessing. They talked about the new home we could buy, the vacations we could take, and the private college Madison deserved. Whenever I said the money had been left to me, my mother corrected me with a smile. Legally, perhaps, she would say, but families share. At 16, I accepted that explanation. At 17, I began noticing things. My father bought a new Mercedes after claiming his business had suffered a terrible year. My mother started renovating the kitchen without discussing how they would pay for it. Madison began showing friends photographs of a luxury apartment in New York and calling it her future home. Whenever I asked questions, my father became angry. "You are a child," he said. "Financial matters are beyond you." 3 months before my birthday, an envelope arrived from a law office in Burlington. My mother grabbed it from the hall table before I could open it. That evening, I saw the same envelope in my father's office trash. I waited until everyone was asleep, then pulled it out and smoothed it across my bedroom desk. It was from Margaret Shaw, the attorney who had prepared my grandparents' estate plan. She wanted to meet with me privately before my 18th birthday. The letter contained one handwritten sentence at the bottom. "Your grandmother asked me to make sure you understood every option before control transfers to you." I called Margaret the next day from the public library. Her voice was calm, but her first question chilled me. "Claire, have your parents told you about the withdrawals?" I did not know what she meant. Margaret explained that my parents had received annual distributions for my education, health care, and living expenses. Those distributions were supposed to be documented. Recently, my father had requested early access to a much larger portion of the estate. He claimed I had agreed to invest in a family real estate company. I had never heard of that company. "Did you sign anything?" she asked. I remembered my father placing forms in front of me 6 months earlier. He said they were school insurance papers. He had covered most of each page with his hand and pointed at the signature lines. My stomach turned. Margaret told me not to confront anyone. She arranged for me to meet her and an independent financial advisor named Daniel Cho. For 3 months, I secretly learned what my grandparents had built and what my parents had attempted to take. The forged investment request had failed because Margaret insisted on speaking with me directly. But the attempt told us something important the moment I turned 18. My parents intended to pressure me into signing away control. Daniel suggested an irrevocable asset protection trust. I would remain the beneficiary, but the principal could not be transferred merely because someone threatened or manipulated me. An independent trustee would review major withdrawals. The trust would pay for my education and reasonable living costs, while protecting the company's shares for the future. It was not a prison for my money. It was a locked door with rules that I chose while I was still free to choose them. I agreed. My 18th birthday fell on a Saturday. My parents threw an enormous party at a country club. More than 100 guests attended. There was a string quartet, a 3-tier cake, and a wall covered with photographs of me from childhood. It should have felt like a celebration. Instead, I noticed that nearly every photograph also included Madison. My mother wore a silver gown that cost more than my first car. My father gave a speech about family loyalty. Then he raised his glass and said, "Tomorrow begins an exciting, new chapter for all of us." People applauded. Across the room, Madison smiled at me and mouthed, "Finally." At 9:15 that night, I told my parents I needed some air. I slipped into a private office near the ballroom, where Margaret was waiting with the final documents. Daniel joined us through a secure video call. My hands shook as I signed. The trust received the cash, investment accounts, and company shares immediately. I retained a small personal checking account containing $12,000. It was enough to begin an independent life, but not enough to tempt anyone expecting millions. Margaret closed the folder and looked directly at me. "Once this is executed, your parents cannot reverse it. Neither can you by yourself. Are you certain?" From the ballroom, I heard my father laughing with his friends. I remembered the hidden letter, the forged request, and Grandma Rose telling needed a soft heart, needed a strong door. "I'm certain," I said. At midnight, my father hugged me in front of the remaining guests. "You are an adult now," he whispered. "Tomorrow, we handle the paperwork." The next morning, my mother entered my bedroom without knocking. My father followed with a leather folder. Madison came in last, carrying coffee and wearing a sweatshirt from the university she planned to attend. My father placed the folder on my bed. "Sign on the marked pages." I opened it. The documents would have transferred $5 million into Bennett Family Holdings, a company formed only 11 days earlier. My father owned 51%. My mother owned 24%. Madison owned 25%. My name appeared nowhere except on the signature line surrendering the money. "What is this?" I asked, although I already knew. My mother sighed as if I were wasting her morning. "It is the family investment plan. Your father has explained it many times." "No, he hasn't." Madison rolled her eyes. "Claire, stop being dramatic. Dad found my apartment. I need the deposit before someone else takes it." I stared at her. "You are 16. It is an investment?" My mother said. "She will use it when she attends Columbia." "She hasn't even applied." My father's face hardened. "Sign the documents." I closed the folder. "No." The room became completely still. My mother laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Excuse me." Grandpa and Grandma left the inheritance to me. "I am not transferring $5 million to a company you created less than 2 weeks ago." My father grabbed the folder. "You ungrateful little girl. Who fed you? Who housed you? Who managed that money while you played student? The estate paid you for my expenses." His expression changed. It was only a flicker, but I saw fear behind the anger. "Who told you that?" I did not answer. My mother stepped closer. Her perfume, usually comforting, suddenly made me feel sick. "Claire, everything we have sacrificed was for you. Your sister has lived in your shadow for years, while everyone talked about your inheritance. It is time to make things fair." Madison crossed her arms. "Grandma only chose you because you followed her around like a sad puppy." Those words hurt more than I expected. Not because I believed them, but because Madison had said them so easily. My father pointed toward the door. "You have 7 days. Sign or move out. If you leave with nothing we purchased." I looked at each of them and finally understood that this was not a sudden argument. They had rehearsed it. The apartment, the new company, the papers, even the threat had all been prepared before my birthday. So I said the sentence that changed everything. "The inheritance is already in a trust." My father blinked. My mother's face lost its color. Madison lowered her coffee. "What trust?" my father asked. "An irrevocable trust. I signed the documents last night. An independent trustee controls major distributions. You cannot move the money into your company." He stared at me as if I had become a stranger. Then he lunged for my phone. I stepped backward and shouted. My mother closed the bedroom door while Madison stood in front of it. "Call the lawyer," my father demanded. "Cancel it." "It cannot be canceled, because you are angry." He seized my wrist. His grip was painful. "You will fix this." Before I could respond, a voice came from the hallway. "Take your hand off her, Richard." Margaret Shaw stood outside the open door with 2 uniformed police officers. I had sent her a one-word text when my parents entered my room. Now, we had planned for pressure. We had not known how ugly it would become. My father released me immediately. Margaret handed him a formal notice. It stated that the estate's financial records were under review, and that all communication about my assets had to go through her office. "This is a family matter," my mother said. "Forgery and misuse of custodial funds are legal matters." Margaret replied. For the first time in my life, my father had nothing to say. I packed one suitcase while an officer waited in the hall. My parents would not let me take the laptop they had bought for school, the car they had given me at 17, or even the pearl earrings from my mother. I left them all behind. As I walked downstairs, Madison followed me. "You ruined everything," she whispered. I turned to her. Part of me wanted to shout. Another part wanted to hug the little sister I remembered, the girl who once crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. Instead, I asked, "Did you know Dad forged my signature?" She looked away. That was my answer. I moved into a small furnished apartment owned by a retired teacher who knew Margaret. The place had one bedroom, a squeaky floor, and a view of a laundromat. I loved it immediately because every key belonged to me. For the next 6 weeks, I attended college orientation and helped Margaret examine the estate records. The investigation revealed more than I imagined. My parents had claimed near $100,000 in expenses over 5 years. Some charges were legitimate. Most were not. My father billed the estate for private school tuition even though my scholarship covered it. My mother charged family vacations as educational travel. Madison's writing lessons, designer clothes, and cosmetic dental work were listed as necessary expenses for my well-being. There were also monthly payments to a consulting company owned by my father's college friend. Daniel traced the money from that company back to my parents. But the strangest discovery was a series of checks, signed by my grandmother during the final year of her life. The signatures looked genuine. Yet Margaret was certain Grandma Rose had not approved them. We examined old calendars, medical records, and bank statements. On the dates the checks were supposedly signed in Massachusetts, my grandmother had been receiving treatment in Vermont. Someone had copied her signature before she died. I felt betrayed all over again. Stealing from me was terrible. Stealing from my grandmother while she was sick felt unforgivable. Then Margaret found a sealed statement Grandma Rose had left with the estate documents. It said she had begun to suspect that my father was pressuring Grandpa for early transfers. She had changed the will after overhearing him describe the company as already ours. My grandparents left the inheritance solely to me because I was the only family member who visited without asking for money. The statement ended with a message addressed to me. "Claire, wealth does not reveal character. It gives character room to act. Use what we leave you to build freedom, not obedience." I cried at Margaret's conference table until I could barely breathe. For weeks, I had wondered whether protecting the inheritance made me selfish. My grandmother's words answered that question. My parents did not see it that way. They launched a campaign to destroy my reputation. My mother told relatives I had been manipulated by greedy lawyers. My father claimed I was emotionally unstable. Madison posted a tearful video online saying her sister had abandoned the family the moment she became rich. The video received thousands of sympathetic comments. I said nothing. Silence was not weakness. It was preparation. 3 months later, my parents sued to invalidate the trust. They claimed I lacked the maturity to understand what I had signed. Their attorney argued that Margaret had turned me against my family to gain control of the estate. The lawsuit forced everything into the open. During discovery, my father had to provide emails, financial statements, and company records. One email to my mother was sent 2 weeks before my birthday. Once Claire signs, I move the 5 immediately. She can keep enough for college, so she doesn't complain. Madison gets the condo, and we use the rest to cover the loans. Another message from my mother said, if she resists, remind her she has nowhere else to live. The evidence was devastating, but my father still refused to settle. He believed he could charm the judge the way he charmed clients. On the morning of the hearing, he approached me in the courthouse hallway. He looked older. His business had lions after the allegations became public. The Mercedes was gone. So was the confident smile. "End this," he said quietly. "Your mother cannot sleep. Your sister is being bullied. You have made your point." "I did not forge documents," I replied. "I did not steal estate money. I did not file this lawsuit. We are your family." You remembered that only when the money disappeared. His eyes narrowed. For one moment, the pleading father vanished and the man from my bedroom returned. "You will regret humiliating me." "No," I said. "I regret trusting you." Inside the courtroom, Margaret presented the trust documents, the forged investment request, the expense records, and my parents' emails. Daniel explained that I had answered every financial question before signing and had chosen protections designed to prevent impulsive withdrawals by anyone, including me. Then Madison was called as a witness. I had not expected that. She walked to the stand wearing a plain navy dress. She looked smaller than I remembered. At first, she repeated my parents' story. She said I had become secretive and cruel. She claimed the family company was meant to benefit everyone. Then Margaret showed her a group message in which Madison had written, "Claire will sign. Dad says she always folds when Mom cries." Madison began to tremble. Margaret asked whether she knew about the New York condo. "Yes," Madison whispered. "Did your father tell you where the deposit would come from?" Madison looked at our parents. My mother shook her head almost invisibly. The judge noticed. "Answer the question," he said. Tears filled Madison's eyes. "Claire's inheritance." "And did you know Claire had not agreed?" A long silence followed. "Yes." My mother covered her face. My father stared straight ahead. Then Madison said something no one had asked. They told me she did not deserve it. They said Grandma loved her more, so taking the money would make us even. That sentence ended the case. The judge upheld the trust in full. He described my parents' conduct as a calculated campaign of financial coercion. Their civil claims were dismissed, and the records were referred to the district attorney. My father later pleaded guilty to fraud and forgery. He avoided prison under a strict agreement but received probation, community service, and a permanent ban from managing client funds. My mother entered a separate plea for filing false expense statements. They were ordered to repay hundreds of thousands of dollars. Their house was sold. Some relatives said I had gone too far. They told me I should have protected my parents from the consequences, but consequences were not something I created. They were simply the final destiny of choices my parents had made for years. Madison stopped speaking to them soon after the hearing. 6 months later, she sent me an email. She did not ask for money. She did not ask me to forgive her. She wrote, "I knew it was wrong, but being chosen felt better than being honest. I am sorry." I read that sentence many times. Eventually, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop. She had taken a part-time job and enrolled at a state university. Without my parents promising her a luxurious future, she seemed frightened but real. "Do you hate me?" she asked. "No," I said. "But I do not trust you yet." She nodded. "That's fair." It was the first honest conversation we had ever shared. We did not become close again overnight. Trust does not return because someone cries. It returns in small pieces when actions begin matching words. Over the next 2 years, Madison kept showing up. She apologized without excuses. She worked. She paid her own bills. When she needed help, she asked for advice instead of money. I allowed the relationship to grow slowly. As for the inheritance, I finished college and studied nonprofit management. With the trustees' approval, I created a scholarship program for students leaving financially abusive homes. I named it the Rose Door Foundation after my grandmother's favorite saying. The foundation did not hand young people millions of dollars. It gave them temporary housing, legal support, counseling, and enough breathing room to make a free decision. On the day we opened our first residence, I stood outside a renovated brick building while a small crowd waited for me to speak. Madison sat in the second row. My parents were not there. I had stopped waiting for them to become the people I needed. That was another kind of inheritance I refused to carry. I told the audience that money had not saved me. Information had helped. Planning had helped. Honest people had helped. But the moment that truly saved me was the moment I accepted that love without respect was only control wearing a familiar face. After the ceremony, a 17-year-old girl approached me. She held a backpack against her chest and asked whether the residence really had a room for her. "Yes," I told her. "And the key will be yours." Her shoulders relaxed. In that instant, I understood why my grandparents had chosen me. They had not wanted me to guard their fortune like a dragon guarding treasure. They wanted me to turn it into freedom. My family tried to teach me that loyalty meant surrendering everything to the people who demanded it most loudly. My grandparents taught me something better. Real love does not ask you to prove it by becoming powerless. On my 18th birthday, I thought I was protecting an inheritance. In truth, I was protecting the person I had not yet been allowed to become. And that was the one thing they could never steal.